Coming up on today's show.
And there's so many ways that people think about boundaries. It can be just like a boundary of saying what you need when you need something from someone. But I'm going to talk about just time boundaries today. So it's exactly what you're talking about.
You know, in broadcasting, when you have a frequency, and you talked about that frequency, if you go beyond a certain boundary of what that frequency is really meant for, then you get distortion.
Because a lot of times that comes up for people, and that's why they can't set the boundaries. They can't even follow the steps if they're not feeling like it's okay to.
How to set and keep boundaries today on Keeping You Organized. Hello and welcome to Keeping You Organized. Today we are going to put a box around it. We're going to put some boundaries up that we do not want to cross. Actually, it's a topic that a lot of people struggle with, you know, and a lot of it has to do with saying yes and no. But really, boundaries are a topic that we're going to bring on our friend Erica Salou from living-harmony.org to talk about boundaries. Erica, how are you doing today?
Awesome. How are you, John?
Well, it is great. And, you know, people have a lot of misconceptions, I think, about boundaries. So let's start off talking a little bit about that. You know, how do we define boundaries and some of the misconceptions?
Well, first, I would love to ask you, if I said to you, what do you think of when you first think of boundaries? If someone says boundaries to you, what comes up for you?
Well, you know, I have 4 girls, so I have teenage girls, so I definitely have strong boundaries when I think about them, but that's probably not exactly what we're talking about today. But, you know, I think boundaries, I particularly think about not trying to do too much and trying to, you know, keep like I said, kind of in the intro, a box around our time and some things like that. But that's just kind of my idea. What do you think?
Sure. No, that is one type of boundary that I'm actually going to stick to, because you know how I love time, talking about time. And there's so many ways that people think about boundaries. It can be just like a boundary of saying what you need when you need something from someone. But I'm going to talk about just time boundaries today. So it's exactly what you're talking about. And sometimes people might think some of the things I talk about aren't related to time, but I will show you how they're related to our time and how that's important. So yeah, you're completely right on. I think that the first thing you started off by saying something about it was like sort of something that you're kind of encasing. You used a word that made me think of something that's sort of rigid. And I think that said, that is the top 4 misconceptions that when I work with clients that I hear and that I hear in my everyday life are these misconceptions about boundaries, that it's like erecting a wall about don't want. Misconception, I'll explain why. That boundaries create rigidness in our lives. Like it makes us really rigid, and no one wants to be like that rigid, you know, person.
Right.
And that if we need boundaries, that means we're weak in some way. Right. That's also a misconception. And the last one that I hear a lot is that setting boundaries are really difficult. Like people feel like, oh my gosh, it's going to be so hard to do.
Right.
So those are the misconceptions. And this is what I want to talk a little bit about, that truth about them. And I'm going to give you my fantastic 5 steps also. How you can actually create boundaries in your life, whether they're work or personal, and give you real life examples and language and everything that you can use. So,
I'm all ready.
So, truth about boundaries. They're actually about getting clear on what we don't want and do want. So we're really getting clear on our needs and acting on it. That's really what boundaries are like. And they actually supply us with freedom, not rigidness. They get us more in touch with our authentic self, like who we are authentically, what we really want. And I believe that when we're in touch with our authentic self, we're like vibrating at a higher vibration. We're like being more who we're meant to be. And that actually uplifts us and also everyone around us. You know, like when you're at your best self, thinking about all the women in your life, right? You're going to interact with them better. If you're cranky, if you're tired, if you feel like you're being pushed to do stuff you don't want to do, you're not going to show up as your best self.
Right.
So I really believe that creating boundaries gives us power. I mean, not just believe, I know that. I see it happen in our lives.
I have to sit in here because, you know, this is an audio and a video podcast, and I'm kind of a techie guy. You know, in broadcasting, when you have a frequency, and you talked about that frequency, if you go beyond a certain boundary of what that frequency is really meant for, then you get distortion. So it's one of
Can I
those.
steal that from you? I'm going to steal that analogy.
Yeah, absolutely. Because that's what you want. You want a clean signal, and you don't want it distorted. Same with our lives. When I think about, when it's well defined, we're not going to have distortion or a mess in our lives. So yeah, you can have that one for free.
I just wrote it down. I'm like, awesome. And it has to do with audio. And like, I'm so into music. That's where the name of my business came from, Living Harmony. So it's perfect.
Yes. Okay, good.
True. Like if we're not being our authentic self, we're like creating more chaos and confusion. There's not as much clarity, right? Which you talked about, being on the right channel, being clear. Exactly. Mm-hmm. So I think that when it makes us more powerful because we're more intentional. Once again, when we talk about time, if we're being intentional, we're not just reacting to what comes to us. We're being proactive, right, in our lives instead of reactive. Right. So I believe that if we don't set healthy boundaries in our lives, none of our relationships work well, whether any kind of relationship, whether it's a boss, a coworker, a lover, a friend. We need boundaries in our lives to get along and have good relationships. I think for like an example is that I hear people sometimes saying that their clients call them at weird hours, like when I work with entrepreneurs, for instance, or even people in personal lives, they'll be like, my friends just like call me really late at night when I'm trying to go to bed. Like that is a boundary, for instance, that we can set ourselves. We don't even need to tell anybody. We just don't answer the phone, right? If we have we don't need to ask for permission from people to have that kind of boundary. So I think that's just one example where we can say that's our boundary, and we don't have to like go on and on and on about it. We just do it, and then people realize, they're not going to get us after 9 o'clock at night. Or if it's work, they're not going to get us after 6 o'clock at night.
Right.
So basically, that's like an example of creating like a boundary that's pretty simple. It's not really hard to do unless you haven't done some internal work.
Right.
So, and also the other thing is the more we set boundaries and we know how to do them in the correct way, in a graceful way, in the right way, they become easier to do, just like anything else. You practice, after a while, it's easy to do. Right. So it's not so difficult as we think.
Right. It's also, it's kind of like the, working out and having a workout schedule, right?
Right. Exactly. And the more that you're going to work out, the more your body's going to get used to it. Or if you're talking about the time of it, it's like the more you do it, the easier it just becomes to like get up and go, or like go at the end of work, because it's becomes more natural for you to do. It's like anything else. Exactly. What I call it in my work is it becomes more unconscious competence. So when we start to learn something new, it can be something that is incompetent. We're incompetent at it altogether. And then as we learn something, it might become a conscious competence, meaning we have to really concentrate in order to get it done. We have to think about it. But once you do something a long time, it becomes an unconscious competence. So like brushing your teeth before you go to bed, most people just do it without thinking. Not everybody. I have clients who have to remember how to do it, but usually that falls under something that we naturally, because we do it all the time, it's a routine or a ritual, and we just do it. So same thing with creating boundaries. Once we start, we get going, it becomes easier and more natural, and it doesn't become as difficult as it might be in the beginning, basically. So if you talk about what you sort of started to say about boundaries in ourselves that we can create, if you think about like our work life, a lot of people who work for themselves or even work for other people nowadays, I hear them say things like, oh, but I love what I do, so it's not really work. So they don't have boundaries between when they work and when they don't work. Their family might be mad at them because they're not finishing work when they say they're going to finish work, or be doing personal stuff with them. So I always think no matter how much we love our work, whether we own our own business or work for somebody else, we still need to have those boundaries around that work that we can create ourselves and do ourselves. And so I think that, once again, a lot of people think, oh, that's going to make me really rigid. But because of technology the way it is, we can be working anywhere, right? Like I can take my laptop here and I can go to the cafe and I can work, and I could work till 10 o'clock tonight if I want. It's because it's possible to do that. In the old days, we couldn't do that. So people have taken this like idea, and now everything's bleeding into everything else. There's no boundary where we say, now I shut down and I go into my personal life. So I think that one thing people can do at work that they can easily do if they work in an office is they can not do work at work, home stuff at work, and vice versa, take home work. And because when people do that, they feel like they're working all the time. So even if they're doing some personal thing at work, they still feel like they're working because they're at work, right? They're sitting in their office at work. So they don't have that feeling of, oh, I'm just doing, my personal stuff now. So I recommend that people, oftentimes when I work with people, I see them bring piles of paper, that personal stuff to work, because they're like, oh, I like it better because I'm getting it done at work. But then they're at work later and they also are fitting it in, trying to fit it in when they're doing other work, and they don't get their work done quick, so they can't leave. Right. So they always feel like they're working. So that's one big thing that I think anyone can do, whether you work for yourself or not.
All right. Now, are these part of the 5 steps or the 5 tips? Okay. We're going to take a quick break then. And when we come back, I want to get into those 5 steps for setting boundaries. So we're talking about boundaries today with Erica Salou from living-harmony.org, and we'll be right back. Would your family be able to easily access your important documents for a major life event? Having your key life documents organized helps ensure that your wishes and assets are managed, retained, and distributed as needed while being less stressful for you and your loved ones. The Life Document Organizer Kit helps you to organize and store key life documents like wills and trusts, healthcare directives, investment and retirement plans, marital documents, key personal contacts, and more. Life events that might trigger a need for these documents include a health condition where someone may need to take over certain responsibilities, or decisions regarding care or communicating your wishes regarding your assets. And access to these important documents is key. The Smead Life Document Organizer Kit is divided into 6 color-coded sections. Each section contains individual folders that pertain to that section. The Smead Wheel of Organization provides an easy reference and guide to recommend what documents should be stored within each section. The Life Documents Organizer Kit has the flexibility to expand by adding additional categories that are specific to your own situation. Being prepared can alleviate your own stress and the stress of others. Keep your life and the documents that matter most in order with the Life Documents Organizer Kit. From Smead, keeping you organized. We are back now on Keeping You Organized, talking about setting and keeping boundaries and how we do that. And we're going to get into our 5 steps for doing it now with Erica Salou from living-harmony.org. Erica, now you teased that at the beginning, so now we got to deliver the goods. And, you know, we do have a boundary of only half the podcast left here, so let's get into these tips.
Already, we're halfway through.
Yes.
Time flies when you're having fun.
Yes.
Well, before I do the 5 fantastic steps, I just want to say that we need to also to start with just in some internal work first, or else it doesn't really work. None of these steps work. It's kind of like you need to learn how to add before you learn how to multiply. Right. So you really need to just have a belief that it's okay, like self-care is okay, and it's okay to be selfish, because a lot of times that comes up for people, and that's why they can't set the boundaries. They can't even follow the steps if they're not feeling like it's okay to do it. Like, for instance, in 2007, there was a Yankovic study that said that 9% of women put themselves first. Only 9% of women. And that 81% of women consider that free time is luxury. That's because they don't put themselves first, right? Mm-hmm. So I think it's a really big issue with women. It can happen with men too, but really that women often don't even think they deserve to, say no or deserve to have their own time. So I just tell people that if you don't believe it, fake it till you make it. And that way you can do the steps and they'll actually work. Okay. Right. Otherwise these steps just, you'll be struggling the whole time. Right. So the first number 1 step is to face the fears and feelings that we have that come up around setting a boundary. So oftentimes we might think, I'm going to set this boundary, whether it's spoken or not spoken, but we have this fear. So like, she might leave me, or they're going to get angry at me, or I'll get fired. And if we don't face them, then we're setting the stage for it to be a disaster. We need to really just feel the feelings and know that we can move through them. So once we know what those fears are, then we can say, okay, I've faced them. What's the worst that could happen? I'm going to survive no matter what happens, even if the worst happens. Mm-hmm. Unless, of course, you're with somebody that's going to take you out in your sleep, which is a whole nother podcast that we have to talk about. You've got bigger issues if that's the case. Right. So you want to start with that, just really feeling those feelings and facing them. Then number 2 is to think of the conversation as not difficult, but as positive. So oftentimes we go into a situation, if it's going to be a spoken boundary, and we think, oh my gosh, I'm dreading this. It's going to be so hard to do. There's this book by the Harvard negotiation folks called Difficult Conversations, How to Discuss What Matters Most. I've always thought, and I've even told some of the people, because I know some of them because I live in Cambridge, that I think that title even just sets people up to think, oh my gosh, this is going to be difficult. So I think we want to look at it as being positive. That's going to be a win-win situation. And then we expect it to be easy. We're like letting go of that resistance that we bring into the conversation. The other person is also going to be more open if we don't come into the conversation thinking this is going to be difficult. The third set is to actually set the boundary. And there's several ways to do this, but you always want to be like in a loving intention, whether it's a work or a personal thing, to go in thinking that it's like I said, a win-win, and you're going in a loving way. Now, you don't always have to have I'm going to talk about a spoken boundary, and then I'll tell you some things about unspoken boundaries. But if it's going to be spoken, you want it to be graceful, you want to be gentle, and you want to do it lightly. And you want to use I language, not you language. So you want to be okay also with sounding vulnerable, because when we use I language, that's vulnerable. But really, once again, we gain power when we're vulnerable. A lot of people have shown us that with research. And so I have discovered that the reason it's better to do it gracefully and light is because sometimes in my past, I've learned the hard way. So I'm giving you like some tips that I've learned. If you set it too heavy, it doesn't work. So I'm like totally in the trenches and reporting from the field. Like I'm not immune to having challenges around this. It's just that I've really learned from my mistakes. And then now I know the tools, like as I'm learning, as I'm going. So for instance, I've definitely had a situation where I had two friends. One I was setting up as a speaker, and one was working with me on this committee. And they kept pushing me to break this sacred boundary that I have around work. And I started feeling guilty. So I broke it a little bit. But in the end, it turned up and blew up in my face anyways, and everyone was mad at me. So I can say that it's really much better to stick to your boundaries. And I kind of think of it as like being like the CIA. So it's like the need to know rule. You know how the CIA says everyone only knows what they need to know for a situation or a task or some mission? If you're soft about it, then you don't have to tell everybody all the details. And it works so much better. So don't over-explain, because when you over-explain, it lets people try to convince you. You're opening the door for them to convince you to change your mind. So some language that's really good, if it's like a personal situation and you're going to actually speak the boundaries, something like, if you want to say something like, it's not a good time for me, if they're pressuring you, or for work, like that doesn't work for me. When you're looking at a calendar, you say, oh, it doesn't work for me. People know what that means. It means that you're busy, but they don't need to know everything that's going up or why you're busy. You might just not be in the mood. That's not lying. Like I'm not into lying, but if you just say, that doesn't work for me, that could mean you're not in the mood. Right. So that really, really works. The other thing you want to do when you're speaking is to start with the positive. So like in a work situation, you might say, because I want the best for the team, I need to leave work on time, for instance, because I'm going to be better when I'm going to be fresher. I'm going to be more creative when I'm there. Or if it's like a personal thing, you could say, start off with, because I value your friendship so much, I want to share with you that, when we travel together, I need 8 hours of sleep. Something where you're starting with the positive and then going into what your need is. And the other thing is, it can also be a silent boundary, like I talked about. So oftentimes we give away our power by thinking that we have to state everything, but you know how they say actions speak louder than words. A lot of times we can just create a boundary and we don't have to tell anybody. We don't have to explain it all. You just do it and the person gets it. And you just, like, for instance, when we talked about the phone, you don't have to answer your phone. You can just have a boundary around when you work and when you don't work. No one has to know all the details. You're just doing it and people get the hang of it, right? Like, let's say you don't read your email every single day. If you don't respond right away, people will start to learn, oh, wait, it may take her 4 days, without you saying anything. And that's what I mean by like a soft boundary. And they often work so much better than like, you know what? I'm not going to read my email sometimes for a week. And so you can't email me if it's something timely. Like that's really harsh, right? As opposed to just doing it and then people will start to learn. Right. Or you can say something like, oh, I didn't see that. I'm not in my email a lot. See how different that sort of sounds? Right. Yeah, absolutely. So I think it just works so much better. Right. Okay.
That was point 3. Right now, we're not into 4 yet, though, right?
No, I'm about to do 4.
Okay, good.
So you have any questions about number 3?
No. I think being positive is a great thing. I just, we got into both the silent and the, not silent.
So within that of setting the boundary, there's like 2 categories, and that's like the one where you speak and the one where you're silent. I just wanted to like cover both of those, because within setting the boundary, you can do it silently or not silently.
Right.
Yeah. So yeah, it's like 3A, 3B.
Okay, that's all right. I didn't want to get lost, so I'm trying to keep on track.
You're good. You keep me on track.
Okay.
The number 4 is a little bit like something that's internal as well. It's you have to be detached from the outcome.
Okay.
So many times once we do set a boundary, we think that we want it to come out a certain way. And if we're attached to it, we need to be more Buddhist. And once we set the boundary, is we don't have control over how someone's going to react. And a lot of times certain people are going to dislike whatever we do, no matter what it is. So what we need to do is to understand that sometimes when we set a boundary, certain people will retreat more than we wished or we expected them to. Some people might overreact, especially if everybody else in their life does something different, right? Like they're used to something different. Or if they're used to you being different. Because oftentimes in our lives, if we've acted in a certain way, then people just expect that of us. And if we want to change something, it's a lot harder. So you can expect that sometimes people retreat, but oftentimes once they have a time to go away and, think about it or like live with it, they come back and they can be accepting of it. And I think it's because all our relationships are a dance. And when you change a step, when you're asking for something different, that person has to change their step in order to be in sync with you. And sometimes that's a learning curve, that's involved. It doesn't just happen overnight. So sometimes it's okay to let them overreact, let them retreat, whatever, and then wait for it to happen, see what happens. And I believe that the people that are meant to be in our lives are going to adjust to that. And then sometimes we lose people along the way, and that's okay. That can happen.
Right.
And it doesn't mean there can't be any back and forth about it, but I've just seen that a lot of times people just need an adjusting period. So number 5, what do you think number 5 is, John? If you had to guess.
Oh man, let's see. We have facing the feelings, being positive, saying no. No.
Well, that's pretty close, actually.
Okay.
It's sticking to the boundary.
All right, there we go.
Because you know what? Doesn't that seem like a no-brainer? Of course, you're going to make the boundary, then you're going to stick to it.
Of course, we're all perfect people, aren't we?
It's a no-brainer, but you know what? I've even done this. I've made boundaries and then broken that because something is enticing about not adhering to that boundary. So the other thing is you have to have a consequence if it's a boundary that someone else can break, that they can disrespect. Just like, a kid, when I work with parents, they'll often say, okay, everyone has to put away their toys before we have dinner. But then they tell the kids that the kids don't put away the toys and they still sit down to dinner. Right. So a child is really super smart. They know, I don't have to really do that. Next time they won't do it because they know that you really weren't serious. Right. So you have to actually stick to it. And then sometimes there has to be some sort of, consequence. So I've worked with people who have said to me my clients, they call me after 10 o'clock. It's so annoying. Once again, okay, but you didn't even have to express that. But if your clients know that, do you have to answer the phone? No, you can leave it go. So it's really about you sticking to the boundary. And similar, in work life, sticking to a contract, it's like that. So sometimes people have contracts in their business, but then they let people break them. The same thing that we were just talking about too, schedules. If you have schedules or cancellation policies in your schedules, in your contracts, you want to actually, once you set it, stick to it. And so sometimes I tell people when they have trouble with this, when it's work stuff, to say, okay, maybe you give someone one get out of jail free card, right? If they break that boundary and you say, okay, right now, the consequence won't happen if it's a business thing. But if you keep letting that person break it, it's not going to work, right? It's just they're just going to know that it doesn't matter what you just said because actions speak louder than words. So sticking to the boundary is the last really important one.
Right. Well, the bottom line is this. If someone sets and keeps boundaries, what can they expect in their life?
They can expect more harmony, more peacefulness, better relationships, more authenticity in terms of getting what they want out of their life. They're going to get more of what they want, whatever that is, because they're doing stuff that's serving them. So it's a lot of really, really, really awesome things happen, right? Those are really big things when we set boundaries.
That's awesome. Well, we're about out of time. I want to give you the opportunity to tell us a little bit about your business, what kind of clients you work with, and how people can get a hold of you.
I work with fellow entrepreneurs and professors, people who set their own schedules. and around their time management, creating less chaos in their life, bringing more harmony and balance by creating schedules and processes and routines, and doing all the stuff we're talking about right now, creating like boundaries around their work life so that they have more harmony in their lives, personal and work.
Great. And your website, please.
Is living-harmony.org.
Awesome. Well, Erica, it has been great here, and I think we're going to have to put a boundary on the end of this podcast because it can't go on forever, but we'll have to have you back on to talk about some of those other topics. But thanks a lot for joining us today.
You're welcome.
Awesome. Well, there you go, folks. Now you understand the value of boundaries, what you can get out of life by implementing them, and you've got the 5 steps, and if you need to check that out, go to our show notes, smead.com/podcast, and you can find out what these 5 steps are. And we'll see you next time on Keeping You Organized.